The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is important, I think, first of all, because it represents the aspirations of the world's indigenous peoples. The indigenous peoples themselves were involved in developing the Declaration over a period of decades. The Declaration is based on initial proposals, initial draft language put forward by indigenous peoples. Secondly, it represents a consensus on the part of the world community and the states of the world participating in the United Nations through its General Assembly. Voted in favor overwhelmingly for the Declaration, essentially agreeing with indigenous peoples on the basic rights and fundamental freedoms that indigenous peoples are to enjoy. And so it's a significant achievement in that regard. Indigenous peoples having put forward their aspirations and the governments of or states of the world having come to a consensus on the document as represented by their collective votes in their action in the General Assembly affirming the rights of the Declaration. Then also the Declaration is important because it represents what could be seen, I think, as a plan of action for governments, the international community, and indigenous peoples themselves to move forward to address the myriad concerns of indigenous peoples and disadvantages indigenous peoples face, problems indigenous peoples face with regard to their basic human rights, including rights over lands and resources, culture, self-determination, basic equality, and human dignity. The Declaration acknowledges that indigenous peoples have suffered the deprivation of human rights over time, over centuries. Indeed, that is the reason for the Declaration, is to address that deprivation of human rights and to do so in terms that are consistent with indigenous people's own aspirations. And so along with that affirmation of indigenous people's fundamental rights, the Declaration essentially puts forward a program of action calling upon governments, states, in cooperation with indigenous peoples to take specific action to address the concerns of indigenous peoples and to move forward to allow indigenous peoples to truly enjoy their basic rights consistent with the Declaration. Human rights have typically been articulated in terms of the rights of the individual vis-a-vis the state. What indigenous peoples have put forward to the world and has been accepted as manifested in the Declaration is that the human rights of indigenous peoples cannot be effectively enjoyed unless that collective dimension is acknowledged. The fact that indigenous peoples in the enjoyment of human rights depend upon those relationships with their kin, with their communities, with their nations, tribes, etc. So, for example, the right to language, unless it's taken into account that right for indigenous peoples is exercised with their communities, with their peoples, it doesn't have much meaning. The right to self-determination is a collective right in that it involves the exercise of rights by the community as a whole, the right to pursue the aspirations, the collective aspirations of the community, for the community to pursue its own destiny under conditions of equality with other peoples. That right of self-determination can only really be understood in terms of the collectivity that exercises it. The right to equality often or usually is looked at in dominant circles as an individual right, but of course equality is not just equality among individuals. It has to be understood as equality among groups themselves. Otherwise, we have what has happened to indigenous peoples in the past, that is the domination of majority groups over indigenous peoples. So the right to equality has to take into account that collective dimension and the exercise of equality of the groups themselves. So the various rights that we see affirmed in the Declaration are at bottom human rights, but what the Declaration does is it contextualizes those basic fundamental human rights: equality, self-determination, right to property, language, culture, and so forth. It contextualizes those rights in light of the particular experiences of indigenous peoples and the collective exercise of those rights by indigenous communities, nations, and peoples. The challenges are myriad and widespread and entrenched in a history of denial of the right to self-determination. So we see basic governance structures of countries, of states, devised to exclude indigenous peoples from decision-making processes, and these governance structures of governments of states have grown up over a period of years, decades, literally centuries. So it's very hard to reform those. So even though there's a commitment in principle on the part of governments of states by their affirmation of the rights in the Declaration, to reform those governance structures is very difficult to do so. The administration of natural resources is done under governance structures that has typically and historically excluded indigenous peoples from the access to natural resources, enjoyment of rights over natural resources that are affirmed in the Declaration. These entrenched governance structures that are put in place to administer natural resources impede the exercise of indigenous people's rights over these resources and are hard to reform. So then you have economic factors, of course, economic interests in place that are developing natural resources on indigenous territories and have done so historically and continue to do so without taking into account indigenous people's rights over those resources. And so it's very difficult in many parts of the world for indigenous people to confront these powerful economic forces that are backed often by entrenched governance structures that have denied indigenous people's rights over these resources. But we see progress in many parts of the world, and I'm hopeful that progress will continue, that as governments and corporations start to understand more about the rights of indigenous peoples and take more action to reform their practices, the governance structures of states, reform corporate practices and so forth, hopefully there will be room for more change. And as indigenous peoples continue to press their rights, continue to press their concerns, and develop capacity to confront corporations, governments, and so forth, I think we will see continued improvements in the conditions of indigenous peoples and the ability of indigenous peoples to truly exercise their rights of self-determination, particularly over lands and resources. First of all, the states need to make sure that the various relevant government agencies and officials are aware of the Declaration. That's a big problem. We see in the international arena at the United Nations, diplomats, the representatives of governments who attend meetings at the United Nations, particularly those having to do with indigenous peoples, typically we see them being very well versed in the Declaration, at least those governments that come from countries where there's significant populations of indigenous peoples. But when it comes to the domestic government agencies that on a day-to-day basis touch upon the lives of indigenous peoples, we very often see an ignorance, a lack of awareness, a lack of due regard for the Declaration. And so states, governments need to take considered action, first of all, to ensure that the relevant government agencies, the various officials that touch upon indigenous people's lives are aware of the Declaration. And then, with that awareness, government agencies and states need to adapt their practices, their administration of programs, for example, education, their administration of lands and resources, to the prescriptions of the Declaration. And they need to do this in cooperation with indigenous peoples, allowing indigenous peoples to be participants in these reforms in the practices of government actors. And in many places what's needed are legislative reforms, reforms in the laws, for example, that govern the state's actions with regard to natural resources or govern access to natural resources or land tenure. These laws that have been in place for decades, more often than not, have not adequately accommodated for or protected indigenous people's rights. And so these laws need to be reformed. So governments and state officials need to do an evaluation comprehensively of the various laws of the country to ensure that their compatibility with the Declaration. And then finally I would say that governments need to ensure that the general population of states, that society in general, is aware of the Declaration, is aware of the issues that is intended to address. The Declaration represents a great educational opportunity, an opportunity for national learning campaigns for people, not just indigenous peoples, but the people of the societies of countries as a whole become aware of indigenous issues, learn about them, learn about the problems of indigenous peoples face, and become part of a national dialogue of reconciliation between indigenous peoples and the larger societies, and of concerted action to rebuild national societies in a way that ultimately they accommodate to and are respectful of indigenous peoples' rights. The Declaration can only be effective for indigenous peoples if they're actively involved in its implementation, in coordination with governments and in coordination with other actors. Implicit in the Declaration are responsibilities on the part of indigenous peoples. For example, in the area of self-determination and self-governance, the right of self-determination of indigenous peoples is affirmed, as well as their right to exercise self-government and autonomy over their local and internal affairs. Of course, these rights can only be effectively exercised if indigenous peoples take on the responsibilities that self-governance and self-determination involve and entail. And so indigenous peoples need to take stock of the responsibilities that they have in light of the Declaration, the stance of the Declaration, and fulfill those responsibilities. And only then can the conditions be in place for indigenous peoples to truly be able to exercise the rights in the Declaration. So it's really a coordinated effort that's needed, one in which indigenous peoples and states are taking on their respective responsibilities in light of the standards of the Declaration and moving forward in a cooperative way to make effective those rights. The implementation of the Declaration is of utmost importance and requires concerted action on the part of all relevant actors, indigenous peoples, states, and others. My fear, and I've expressed this in a number of forums, is that states and others might become complacent by having achieved simply the adoption of the Declaration. Often I hear that governments are translating the Declaration into indigenous languages, are publishing it in a nice little document and passing it out. And that's all good, and that's part of that educational consciousness raising, consciousness raising about the Declaration that I mentioned is necessary. But real action is needed to implement the Declaration so that it is exercised on the ground. Otherwise, it will be simply a reminder of what indigenous peoples have failed to enjoy. It'll be a reminder of how indigenous peoples have not been enjoyment of basic rights, and it will be a reminder of what those rights are that indigenous peoples have not been able to enjoy. I would like much more to be a reflection of the rights that indigenous peoples are in fact enjoying. There's a responsibility by the international community and states on an individual basis to ensure that indigenous peoples have access to technical and financial assistance necessary to enjoy their rights, to negotiate over lands and resources, for example, to build the kind of self-governance and autonomy institutions, or develop those institutions in the modern world. A lot of assistance is required, but assistance of the kind that is destined to allow indigenous peoples to exercise greater self-determination, not assistance of the kind we've seen in the past that leaves indigenous peoples in a condition of dependency